Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to do a Friday reads, hopefully, if I time this correctly and get it done. Otherwise, it'll just be a weekly read on some day of the week. The first book I want to talk about is The Writing Life by Dillard. I read this with Shellyish Swearingen. It's a slim little book. Didn't take us very long at all. It's interesting. And still well written, but a little weird with its messaging. It's very idiosyncratic and particular to her, which is fine, but it does make it very difficult to assimilate any of the information that she's giving if you are interested in the craft yourself. If you just want to know more about her, it's somewhat instructional, but in terms of you internalizing it and using it in your own craft, it might be an interesting foil, I guess, to use in that respect, but otherwise it's very odd, I would say, especially towards the latter chapter where it seems to veer in a strange direction that doesn't feel like it has much pertinence and is quite long. So yeah, it's just very strange, but illuminating towards Dillard herself. So there's that. It just depends if you think the writing life is more like going to be knowledge for you honing craft rather than her supposing what you might want to know about her writing life. So I then read The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger, and I had already seen the new HBO adaptation. I haven't seen the movie. I really like this book. The plotting is very fun, and it raises some interesting questions. Basically, this is about a guy who, because of the way time flows, for instance, if he is in the current time period, then he is able to exercise choice, free will, stuff like that. And if he's in the past, whatever has happened will happen. And it's not to say really the removal of choice, it's that you've already decided to do that thing. And no matter what else you try to do, that will already have come off. So there's no reasons presented or instances in which you could otherwise do something, which is interesting to think about. And it also has like an interesting romance angle where he at a later age meets his wife-to-be supposedly at a very young age. I think like 8, something like that. She's very young anyway. And anytime he time travels, he is naked. So he becomes like a hustler, a grifter, a thief. You know, he's good at brawling, stuff like that. He has to engage in whatever activity that he shows up when he needs to take clothes and stuff like that. But then the flip side also is he appears to his would-be wife at a young age and sort of like spends time with her in a way that he tries to make less creepy, basically. Like they play games, they get to know each other. And essentially there's this notion that whatever his affliction with time travel, there are events in his life that he returns to over and over and over again, very pivotal moments. And of course his wife is one of those. So he is drawn there at a later date, at which time when he is younger, she has sort of courted him in a way, or at least gotten to know him in a substantial way, whereas he's slightly older, 6 years older, 7 years older, something like that. He has no idea who she is because he at that time hasn't reached the age in which he first traveled back to see her. So he's kind of like a douchebag-ish dude, like a typical 20-year-old guy, but with a special problem. So there's a lot of interesting things. It's heavily towards drama. It's not like an action-packed thing. There's some ominous portents at the beginning For instance, she never sees him past a certain age, which begs the question, what happens at that age? And lots of, yeah, like it, I think she said that it was inspired in the before word of wives waiting for their sailors' husbands out at sea to come back. And so her role is sort of like less big than you might expect from the actual title of the book. But I think does a pretty good job of evoking that sort of unique circumstances that she has to deal with, as well as like this unknowing dread, basically. Every time he leaves, will he come back, especially past this certain age and whatnot. So there's a lot of interesting stuff, and the most interesting stuff is how it is plotted. When he gets to where, what happens then, it must have been a huge task to plot this book, and it is very fun to consume. I wish I kind of had read the book first and then saw the TV show, because the book is better in some ways than the show. It diverges in a few instances pretty dramatically when Claire is a teenager in particular. I think that's her name, Claire. Yeah, Claire. And yeah, otherwise it's similar and fun, but the book is more tight, more interesting, and the plotting, I think, comes through a little bit better maybe in the book overall. But the HBO show is still great, I think. Next, I read an excellent book, The Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal Lecter #2 by Thomas Harris. I give this 5 stars. The audiobook is also pretty great, too. I'm sure everybody knows this story. It's about a junior FBI agent who, because of her circumstances and her gaining of the ranks and kind of knowing Jack Crawford, who's the head of the behavioral sciences, I think it's called at the time, her positioning makes her an ideal candidate to interview Hannibal Lecter on a active subject who is going around murdering people, and his name is Buffalo Bill. The cops are kind of like a little bit lost as to how they might profile the person, get all that kind of stuff, and it's the early days of that kind of programming at the FBI anyway. It's not all guesswork, but it's very nascent. And I thought it was just absolutely excellent to be in her actual mind in this book. Like, she is just much more vibrant of a character than in the film. The film is very excellent, but you don't get her processes and just how well she's written as a woman, I think, comes through in this much more so. Also, in the movie, there's a lot of insinuation, I guess, that Buffalo Bill is a trans person, whereas in the book, it is diligently, almost constantly, putting in information about how trans people and Buffalo Bill diverge, as well as like pertinent stats, at least of the day, of how trans people are misprofiled, or like the general idea of trans people at the time is pretty currently like dispelled in this, which is pretty fascinating. He obviously knew that readers would default to Buffalo Bill being trans, or that law enforcement would default to it, and probably have a lot previously. And to some degree, this combats that thinking as well. So it's fascinating in that way. And the actual story is just fantastic. It's a lot more nuanced than the movie. The interactions between Hannibal and Starling is much better, I would say. Like 110% better, even though the movie is excellent. Like, if you like that interchange and Starling's backstory with The Silence of the Lambs, you should pick up the book, because it is much more interesting and compelling, I think, in this format. Next, I read a really great book, to my surprise, little brother, Cory, Doctorow. Again, the audiobook is quite good with this too. I can recommend it. This should be in classrooms being taught, I think. It is fantastic. It is definitely accessible. It's meant for young adult, like teenage audiences. And it's about, in San Francisco, a group of hackers, I guess you could say, like counterculture kids who use a thing called XNet, which is a program used on modded Xboxes, which are very outdated now, but at the time I had one and it was pretty radical, I guess, to have it. You could run your own software. These people make a client basically that allows people to discuss and speak to each other, as well as program their own games for Xbox, play them together, all that kind of stuff. It's a vibrant community and it's considered illegal, of course. Then a terrorist bomb goes off in San Francisco, destroying a bridge, and these kids coming back from a geocaching fun-filled evening, like a hunt, like a scavenger hunt using geocoordinates, basically, if you know what that is, are taken in by the police, and they are tortured for information despite not having any cause for it, and the kids are not let go for some time, and then they are also sort of threatened by the government to not divulge what occurred there or else. And it's about the main character, Marcus, kind of like being radicalized by this, but in a slow way. Like his trauma has very much hampered his ability to process what happened, because he is lying to his parents because he believes the government will come and arrest him or arrest his parents or do more stuff, like he was waterboarded, for instance. And so he's kind of living in fear, and it's about all of that kind of stuff, privacy issues. It's very much an issue book stuffed into a kind of like decent plot with like fairly good character work, but not amazing stuff. But it's meant to educate teenagers in why freedom of expression and different rights should be indelible, and how and why people should care about these things, and also how they can mobilize and contact each other when the government is monitoring them and stuff like that. It is just really excellent at what it does. It's phenomenal. It's part of a trilogy. This is the first book. And then lastly, I read The Man Who Saw Everything by Deborah Levy. This book was fine. I thought it would be better, to be honest. It's very strange. It's surrealistic. So I read this with Shelley Swearingen as well, and I'm glad I did. We each had like a different way of coming at the book, and I think that she helped me make more sense of what was going on with this. But probably the less you know about it, the better in some ways, because the book has a reveal that it hinges on about halfway through, in which things shift a lot, and your preconceptions of the beginning, in which this man almost gets hit by a car, and then he goes overseas and has these really odd experiences with these people as a very like privileged white man in pre-fall of the wall Berlin, and he like constantly is like this bumbling kind of doofus guy who doesn't understand other people's issues, problems. He falls out with his girlfriend. He's just a very unlikable character who doesn't get anybody else's problems. He's very self-centered, and then it kind of flips and you find out a little bit more as to why that is, but it's definitely a spoiler as to why. That switch did help somewhat. It was like an interesting concept, but the actual plot beats themselves were not super interesting or impactful to me. And so it became like, it exceeded my expectations and I gave it 4 stars, but the enjoyment factor, I guess you could say, is more like a 3-star level. I think what the book was doing and it like succeeded at it, but as what I want out of surrealistic components and what I was hoping for from the book didn't quite jibe with what it was doing. I know some people absolutely adore this book and absolutely love it, so I'll probably reread it in the future at some point, knowing what the turn is and seeing if that like helps or impacts the second go around. And it's quite short anyway, so it wouldn't be too much time to do so. But yeah, just an odd duck, basically. That's the Friday reads. Hope everyone is doing well. Winter is well and truly upon us here in Canada. We got like 3-4 feet of snow. I opened the door and I couldn't get out. I had to get a shovel to get out. So take care of yourselves. If you haven't had winter yet, it is definitely coming. It is definitely not leaving Canada at that amount of snow. We'd have to have a Chinook come through. If you don't know what that is, you should Google it. It happens here sometimes, and it's a godsend.